Hey everyone, my name is Rob Buscher and I'm helping to moderate this panel today on the evolution of the Nikkei press for the 2025 Taguma virtual pilgrimage. It's a great honor to be in conversation with two individuals who have been doing this work far longer than myself. For the past decade or so, I've been a contributing writer at Pacific Citizen, and I'm also a past editorial board chair of the PC. And then certainly we have the experience of two seasoned journalists who will be talking to us a little bit about the past history of these role that Japanese American newspapers have played within the broader community landscape, as well as talking about the role that they're currently playing, and finally sharing some thoughts about the future of Japanese American news within the community space. So at this point, I'd like to ask both of our panelists to provide a self-introduction, and we'll turn it over to you first, JK.
Okay, I'm JK Yamamoto. I guess I'm actually one of the OGs of the community press because I've been in it for more than 40 years. I was at the Pacific Citizen from 1984 to 1987. That's the newspaper of the Japanese American Citizens League. Then I was at the Hokubai Mainichi in San Francisco as English editor from 1987 to 2009, which was the year it went out of business. And then since November of 2010, exactly 15 years ago, I've been with the Rafu Shimpo as a reporter for the English section.
Thank you very much for that, and we certainly look forward to hearing more about all the work that you've done in those different publications. Kenji, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kenji Taguma. I originally from the countryside of West Sacramento. Came to the Nichi Times in 1995. So this past September, celebrating my 30th year here. Started when I was 9 years old. Anyways, I was fortunate that the person who hired me was the last one of the 6 co-founders of the Nichi Times. So I was able to learn a little bit more about the history of the publication. Yeah, I covered a lot over the last 30 years, and over the last 16 years, of course, in 2009, as the Nichi Times was closing, we started the Nichi Foundation as a what I think is the first nonprofit ethnic community newspaper of its kind in the country, rising from the ashes of a for-profit model. And there was really no model to follow, so it was very chaotic and frantic at first, which I'll share in the video.
Yeah, thanks for that. And we look forward to hearing some more about that. So I know you have a couple of visual aids that you're going to share with us, Kenji. Would it make sense to start with a video, or should we maybe talk a little bit about kind of the history of Japanese American news in the landscape?
Yeah, you can start with the video.
Okay. All right, let's do that then.
The Nichi Foundation is informed and inspired by 2 historical pillars, one being the Nichi Shimbun, which was formed in 1899 by Kyutaro Abiko, said to be the most influential Japanese immigrant in America. Not only did he launch the Nichi Shimbun, but he also founded 3 Japanese farming colonies in California's Central Valley, a labor contracting company that hired Japanese immigrants, a bank, and a program to send Nisei to Japan to learn more about their culture during the summer. After he passed away in 1936, the Nichi Shimbun was taken over by his wife, Yona Abiko, who was the younger sister of Umeko Tsuda, the founder of Tsuda College in Japan. Yona Abiko also was the chief fundraiser for the Japanese YWCA, which is now home to Nihon Machi Little Friends. After the war, some former staff members of the Nichi Shimbun started Nichi Times, to get the community reconnected after their devastating wartime experience in American concentration camps. They founded the Nichi Times as a way to get the community reconnected, and one of the 6 leaders of that movement was Shichinosuke Asano. Mr. Asano was a protege of the first commoner Prime Minister of Japan, Takashi Keihara, who told him to go to America and make something of himself. Mr. Asano used early pages of the Nichibei Times to start a movement for post-war relief for Japan. Some 17 tons of relief goods were sent to Japan from America, and 20% of those were raised by Japanese groups in North and South America after the war using different relief societies. Although Japanese Americans came out of camp with nothing, Mr. Asano and others knew that those in Japan were even more devastated because of the war and starvation, so they felt a responsibility to send relief goods to Japan.
Kunisaku Mineta, the father of former San Jose Mayor, Congressman, and Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta, was the San Jose branch manager of the Nichibei Shimbun and Nichibei Times from 1918 to 1968. In fact, Norman Mineta himself was perhaps the most famous Nichibei delivery boy, long before an international airport and freeway were named after him. The Nichibei Times board of directors decided to close the newspaper in September of 2009. In anticipation of that, on July 27th, we established the Nichibei Foundation to primarily launch the first nonprofit ethnic community newspaper of its kind in the country, the Nichibei Weekly. Rising out of the ashes of the historic Nichibei legacy in the worst economic climate in 40 years was by no means easy. These were uncharted waters. There was no nonprofit model to follow, so we essentially had to create one with very limited time and resources. The closure was announced in the August 10th edition, just 3 weeks before the final edition of the Nichibei Times. The beginning of this third chapter of the Nichibei legacy was very tumultuous, but we thought the community needed a news resource, a means to keep people connected. Within a month, the Hokubei Mainichi, the last Japanese-American bilingual newspaper in Northern California, closed. Little did we know that this was just the beginning. What started as a newspaper would evolve into something far more ambitious, a multifaceted educational and cultural institution that would redefine what a community foundation could be.
The Nichibei Foundation gave birth to the first nonprofit ethnic community newspaper of its kind in the country, in the worst economy in some 4 decades. The Nichibei has always been about being the glue that holds a community together, be it culturally, historically, socially, politically, spiritually, or emotionally. It became incumbent upon us to document the community's history for generations to come. Many of the special editions produced by the Nichibei Times were refined and published in the Nichibei Weekly, including the New Year's edition, the Japanese Culture and Cherry Blossom Festivals Guide, the Obon and Summer Festivals Guide, Home and Garden issue, Health and Wellness issue. The Japanese Culture and Cherry Blossom Festivals Guide became our effort to preserve Japanese culture in America, providing vast listings of Japanese cultural arts classes, a guide to Japanese cultural festivals across the country, and a directory of Japanese cultural centers in North America, as well as summer cultural programs. The San Francisco Japantown Map and Directory, what we call our Japantown Empowerment Project, was vastly revamped in 2019. It highlights new businesses, Japantown favorites, as well as a history walk. Moreover, it continues to boast the most comprehensive map and bilingual directory ever developed of the ethnic enclave. To further promote and empower San Francisco's Japantown, we are now working with a distribution company to bring it to some 300 locations across the Bay Area. In 2012, the Nichibei Foundation launched what would become our signature fundraiser, the Northern California Soy and Tofu Festival. The festival has brought together food vendors, artisan vendors, cooking demonstrators, and live entertainment in an afternoon of creative fun for the entire family. All the while, it has served as a vehicle for community building and leadership development. As the Nichibei Weekly likely publishes the most book reviews per year of all Asian American publications, it was natural to help further empower authors by collaborating on author events, often in partnership with other organizations. But the evolution of the foundation as an educational institution came to a head in the development of 3 events in particular, which not only became core programs of the Nichibei, but also some of the most meaningful community events overall. Films of Remembrance was launched in 2012 to provide filmmakers a venue to showcase their work on the Japanese American concentration camp experience during World War II. The event has grown to become the Foundation's signature educational program and the premier event of any of its kind in the country, spanning some 90 film screenings over 9 years, while expanding to Sacramento in 2017, New York City in 2019, and to San Jose's Japantown in 2020. The Nichi Foundation launched the Nikkei Angel Island Pilgrimage in 2014 to get the community reconnected to our nearly forgotten legacy on the island, in partnership with the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation and the National Japanese American Historical Society. With more than 650 attendees, it was perhaps the largest Japanese American community gathering on the island. The immigration station may have been lost forever, however, had it not been for those who we honored at the pilgrimage in 2014. Through 4 Nikkei Angel Island pilgrimages, we now have reconnected some 1,700 or more people to this nearly forgotten legacy, helping to rediscover our Nikkei roots while honoring our immigrant ancestors. On October 7, 2017, we launched our first pilgrimage to the historic Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony in Placerville, California, the site of the first large settlement of Japanese America, established on June 8, 1869. On October 5, 2019, we launched our second pilgrimage to the site, the birthplace of the first Japanese American and gravesite of the first Japanese woman buried in America, Okei Ito. Volunteers from the California Genealogical Society have been able to reunite hundreds with their family histories at both pilgrimages. In furthering the Nichi legacy of community leadership through media, the Nichi Foundation has also held some special programs over its short tenure. 2015 marked the 20th anniversary of Kayohata's groundbreaking Picture Bride, the first major film written, directed, and produced by Asian American women. The Nichi Foundation benefit screenings included discussions and a reception with actress Tamlyn Tomita. In 2016, we organized 3 benefit screenings of Persona non grata, the story of Chiyune Sugihara, known as the Japanese Schindler, for issuing transit visas that saved the lives of some 6,000 Jewish refugees. 5 local descendants of such survivors met with descendants of the Japanese diplomat from Japan. In November of 2016, due to a rash of post-election hate crimes seemingly inflamed by the racial rhetoric of the Trump campaign, the Nichi Foundation took a lead role in organizing United for Compassion, a Japantown vigil against post-election hate. This collaborative event brought out hundreds in unity against racial scapegoating. A United Compassion 2 was held in 2018. And to mark the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Nichi Foundation took a lead role in presenting a virtual remembrance 75 years after atomic bombings on August 9, 2020, in collaboration with the Friends of Hibakusha and the Japanese American Religious Federation.
Thanks for that video, Kenji, and that was a really good way to kind of give us a quick glance at both the history of Nichi Times as well as the more recent work that the Nichi Foundation has done with you at the helm. I know that it's been an interesting transition, to say the least, going from the historic publication and really continuing this forward in a new generation of Nichi and obviously the breadth and scope of the programming that you've just demonstrated through that video gives us a sense of how some of these legacy publications are able to make that pivot successfully so in the case of Nichi I wonder, before we continue on, maybe we could think a little bit about the origins of some of these other Nikkei press. And because it did such a good job of sort of contextualizing the role that Nichibei Times played when it was founded in the turn of the century. I know Rafu Shimpo was founded, I think, 1903, so just a few years later. And then it wasn't until, I think, 1929 that Nikkei Shinmin, the precursor to the Pacific Citizen, JK, you might know better than I. Is that about right in terms of the dates?
Yeah, I can give a very brief rundown of the three papers where I worked. Yeah, Pacific Citizen started in 1929 at the same time as the JCL. And they actually were able to, most of the papers had to close during the war, of course, but the Pacific Citizen moved to Salt Lake City, which was outside the exclusion zone, and they continued to publish during the war. And then after that, they moved to LA, where they still are today. The Hokusai Mainichi started in 1948, but the staff had come from some of the San Francisco papers previous, that had been published prior to the war, like Shinsekai and Hokubei Asahi. So they continued publishing from 1948 until 2009. And then, yeah, Rafu Shimpo started in 1903, and they had to suspend publication during the war also. And then they came back to Little Tokyo, I think, in 1946, and we've been publishing ever since.
Yeah, thanks for that roundup, and I think it's impressive to think about the scope and the timeline, and it's clear that these papers have played a very important role for the Japanese American community, as we saw a little bit in the video as well. This idea of trying to establish a community where there is none for this first generation of the Issei, the sort of diasporic community that is clearly seeing the United States as their home. Not of the Issei who, in some cases, were thinking of going back to Japan eventually, but really wanting to establish roots here, raise their Nisei children, and create some important legacies that their children and then grandchildren could continue to understand and practice elements of Japanese culture. I see that transition, as you mentioned, in the wartime is very important too, right? To understand the trajectory of the Nikkei press. I've always been very interested in that time period when we see that Rafu becomes the Rocky Shimpo, right? When they were publishing temporarily, or
that was a separate newspaper. They were published in Denver, and so they weren't affected by the exclusion order. So they also continued to publish during the war.
So with Rocky in Denver, and then with the staff of the Pacific Citizen in Salt Lake City, there is some modicum of unfettered access to Nikkei press during that time period. But of course, we also see so many of the camps creating their own newspapers to varying degrees of professionalism. The Heart Mountain Sentinel comes to mind as the most professional outfit, but I guess Manzanar Free Press would be another great example. Other camps had smaller camp newsletters. What's your kind of viewpoint? I don't know to what extent either of you have done some research around the wartime usage of the newspapers, but from your understanding, what role did the newspapers play at that time period for the Japanese American community?
Are you talking about during the war?
Yeah, during the wartime.
Right. Well, I mean, publications like the Rocky Shimpo and the Salt Lake Pacific Citizen, and I'm not sure when the Utah Nippo was around, but they also published for several years. I mean, they served an important role because they were free and letting people know, people who subscribed to the publications know about what was going on, and people who were free to know what was going on in camps. Camp papers, they were censored, but they also played a role. Sue Kunitomi Embry was a writer for the Manzanar Free Press, and Walt and Millie Woodward, the now famous publishers of the Bainbridge Island Review, they actually had some writers within the camps. Paul Otaki comes to mind, who wrote about what was going on in Manzanar for their communities back home. So the Bainbridge Island Review published some of those articles to let people know. And of course, Walt and Millie Woodward were heroes for being a lone voice and cautioning the scapegoating of Japanese Americans, both after Pearl Harbor and urging people to welcome the residents back to Bainbridge Island after the war.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting too, thinking about the examples of Japanese Americans who did write for outside publications during the wartime. Another person who comes to mind is Mineo Kubo, right, with her etchings and then later the actual writing that she did for Fortune magazine in documenting some of the camp experience. It's interesting because the issue that appeared in of Fortune is actually quite hostile, as you might imagine, filled with anti-Japanese propaganda during the war with Japan, and it's kind of a special focus into Japan. For that to be then included in that issue, in some ways, I think provided an important and much needed counterpoint to demonstrate to the broader American public that, you know, Japanese Americans are Americans, and this is a distinct population from the people that we're at war with. And at the same time, you kind of wonder if that message gets lost in the kind of inclusion in the broader publication. But either way, there's a number of journalists who then sort of emerge from camp into the post-war era, both within Nikkei press rooms and I think in broader journalism. One person that I'm thinking of, Horst Yoshinaga, who became like the longtime sports writer, right? And I think he was at Rafu for a number of years. Did you overlap with him at all, JK?
Oh, well, actually, he was at the costume Nichi for several years. And I think his column was the most popular feature of that paper. And then when the Kashu went out of business, he switched over to the Rafu. And then he wrote for us for the rest of his life. So yeah, he's very, very outspoken, maybe more conservative than our staff, but you know, the Nisei enjoyed reading him, so we were glad to have him.
Yeah. And then of course you had Bill Hosokawa, who's writing for the Heart Mountain Sentinel, who went on to work at the Denver Post. And we would be amiss if we didn't mention the importance of Jimmy Omura, James Omura, who was at the Rocky Shimpo in Denver. And Jimmy was a lone voice in support of the resistance at Heart Mountain. And so much so that he, you know, got tried as a co-conspirator, although, you know, his thing is obviously a freedom of press issue. But he wrote some really strong editorials for that publication back then. And for it, he was ostracized. Bowling leagues that he was in disappeared. When people visited his home, you know, they told him to turn off the lights so no one could see them visiting his home. And he was pretty much lost to Japanese American history until he showed up at a hearing for the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. People thought he passed away. But thanks to the work of you know, historian Art Hansen, a beloved historian who we just lost, big advisor of myself and a contributor to the Nichibei. He helped to resurrect his story through Jimmy's memoirs, Nisei Naysayer, that came out a few years ago. So it's important to, you know, learn about those pioneering and principled figures.
Yeah, this idea of the sort of voices of dissent, especially at that time period, being lost within the dominant narrative of the service and sacrifice, which of course, you know, the 442 remains an important part of our lineage and legacy as a community. And at the same time, you know, I imagine there was tremendous pressure, especially on the censored press, not to talk about the resistors of conscience in Heart Mountain, or even, for that matter, the individuals that were resisting through legal means, like Korematsu and Hirabayashi. In terms of the, maybe we could pivot a little bit to the post-war resettlement, because that's a time period that I'm very interested in, being in Philadelphia and the East Coast, we really didn't have a Japanese American community to speak of until the mid 1940s, and it really only manifests because of the wartime resettlement, particularly here in Philadelphia, where we had less than 50 Nikkei on the 1940 census, and that balloons up to about 7,000 in 1946. And, in a sense, at that moment, I think Pacific Citizen became a very interesting publication because it was, in my opinion, truly the first national Japanese American newspaper in that regard, because you have suddenly all of these Nisei and Sansei who are spread out throughout the country in regions where there had really been no visible Japanese American community up until that point. And we start to see people writing about those experiences, and we start to hear updates, not just during the immediate resettlement, which of course is a major focus, even in the camp papers, talking about so-and-so family has now gone to Chicago and this is what they're doing. But beyond that, in this resettlement period, when JACL chapters become very important beacons for community to create the common bonds that they were missing from the pre-war era, in whether people lived in Japantowns or in the more rural Japanese American farming communities, suddenly being thrust into these uncommon, familiar places in the country that frankly still had quite a bit of anti-Japanese racism and hostility left over from the war. Both the JACL chapters and then the Pacific Citizen, I think, provides a window into those experiences in a way that some of the other West Coast publications that are kind of centered around specific Nihon machis were maybe not able to. And I'm just kind of curious, from both of your perspectives, how do you see like post-war resettlement being shaped by the Nikkei press?
Well, I'll just say that, the Pacific Citizen did play a very important role because it went out to anybody who was a JCL member, no matter where they lived. And also, even if you weren't a JCL member, you could still subscribe. So it was, I think, has been the only national Japanese American paper. And so people could find out what was happening not only in their area, but in other parts of the country. And it sort of serves that same function today, I think. Although, of course, there are a lot of other alternatives in terms of media.
Yeah, and there were a host of Japanese American publications. I remember when I first came to the Nichibei, I got a document from Seizo Oka at the Japanese American History Archives, which had a catalog of all the Nikkei papers. And I think, at the time, there was probably a dozen of them across the country still. The New York Nichibei, I believe, opened in the 40s and closed in the 90s. The original archives were at the Japanese American Association of New York, if you want to check them out. Seattle had publications, Utah, Denver. Besides the Rocky Shimpo, later it would be the Rocky Nippo, I believe, that closed down the last 20 years. But yeah, the Pacific Citizen was there because of its relative association with the JACL, which was a very controversial organization during the war due to its accommodationist, assimilationist stand. Obviously had its detractors as well. But yeah, when I asked the last living founder of the Nichibei Times, who hired me, why they started the paper, they wanted to get the community reconnected. And people who were living in Sacramento moved to San Francisco. People were Fresno moved to San Jose. So everything was scattered. So using the publication to get people connected and have this resource played an important role in the resettlement of Japanese America, much like Kyutaro Abiko, who tried to dissuade the Issei from giving up their sojourner dreams of going back to Japan, right? But he really encouraged people to settle in America, so much that he created these colonies. The press had played a large role in the settlement and resettlement of the community. And of course, later with redress.
Yeah, so it's this kind of interesting window then, right, between, say, the immediate post-war resettlement when the Nikkei press is sort of helping people to get reconnected in certain ways, and then whether or not they went to the East Coast or Midwest, or if they were resettling in another region of the West Coast than they had previously lived. So then there's this kind of moment, right, of transition in the late 1960s when like the sansei of a particular age are sort of coming of age, becoming politicized, having lived through the civil rights movement and sort of getting involved in ethnic studies and the Third World Liberation Front in the Bay Area and in the broader sort of coalition spaces of the Yellow Power movement, also in Los Angeles. And I'm kind of interested too in thinking about like how we define press, and I would maybe be expansive in calling something like Ghidra, the zine that starts at UCLA. I would call that press too, even if it's small press, because they did have that sort of circulation, and it was a subscriber base that extended beyond the students and even beyond the state of California. I know that there are some progressive elders here in the Philadelphia area that were subscribers to Ghidra throughout the years that it was operated. But in that kind of moment, when there's this sort of politicization of sansei, there's more adult sansei that are starting to come into conversation, not just in JACL, but in other Japanese American community spaces around the country. I see the press as kind of providing that public sphere where there's an option for discourse and kind of allowing through editorials specifically and letters to the editor an opportunity for opposing viewpoints to kind of have these conversations about things like redress. And I'm just wondering from both of your vantage points, what is the role that the Japanese American press plays in that time period in ultimately building a case for redress and getting the community to support something that many people saw as a potential threat to creating or resurging some of the anti-Japanese hostility that they had faced during the war?
JK, you lived through that, so that's all you.
Okay, well, that's true. In the beginning, a lot of people were doubtful about the redress campaign. Maybe they thought we deserved redress, but they thought there was no way it was ever going to happen. So I think that there was a lot of discussion in the community press, a lot of editorials, a lot of letters to the editor, during the commission hearings in 1981. But I think the Rafu Shimpo and other papers encouraged people to testify at those hearings, especially people who had been in camp. And then they reported on the progress when redress legislation was introduced, which members of Congress were supporting it, which were opposed. And this went on until the bills finally passed, the House bill in 1987, and then the Senate bill, and then finally President Reagan signing the redress bill in 1988. So we covered all the arguments for and against, and also tracked the progress of the campaign as it went on. It went on for a number of years before it finally succeeded.
And then, I credit the collective web of the Nikkei press because there were, a fairly large number of them at that time. But someone who subscribed to a Japanese American newspaper. But I credit the Nikkei press with helping to spread the word of, how to apply for redress. Initially, they only thought 60,000 people were going to get it, but it ended up being 80,000. So much so that the educational fund shrank from 50 million to 5 million at the end, which was manifested through the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund. But yeah, without the Nikkei press, could we have found so many more applicants? Something I always wonder. I wasn't really around, or I was too naive for the original redress movement, but something I did am grateful to have a role in is the movement for redress 10 years later, the Japanese American Railroad and Mine Worker redress movement. Michi Wegland, the great historian, author, activist, was encouraging victims of railroad workers and mine workers who were fired after Pearl Harbor to write into the Nikkei press to share their stories for the first time. And so they wrote letters, editorials. Nichi wrote editorials and about why they deserve redress. Right. This was in 1998. They finally, 10 years late after the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, that group of 200 or so families won redress under the radar of mainstream press, under the radar of even a large number of activists. Sure, NCR in LA really supported their movement as well, and I remember when Patty Wada got a group of those victims gathered to talk about it then, but it was very seldom covered. The LA Times covered it after they won redress, but it's something that you could see a movement gaining steam with all these letters, because the Office of Redress Administration, ORA, subscribed to the papers, right? So they knew they could get a sense of the pulse of the community. So when you see a bunch of people writing angry letters saying why they deserve redress, they eventually got the picture.
Yeah, I'm wondering too, JK, if you could provide some more color to that time period of the 1980s specifically, because I think one of the interesting things from the historical timeline is sort of the overlap of the U.S.-Japan trade war from like its earliest inception of the 1970s through like the mid 1990s, between auto industry and later the microchips. And all of that time period, in the middle of it at least, is when redress is really being fought for, right? In a legislative standpoint, after Personal Justice Denied is released, and up until 1988, there's a solid window of time when a lot of Japan bashing was happening in sort of mainstream press areas. How did the Japanese American press sort of stand up to that? What was the tenor of the sort of coverage at that time period? Just from your perspective as someone who was writing at that time.
We addressed, there were a lot of misconceptions at the time about Japanese Americans, and a lot of the mainstream reactions to the redress movement were based on the inability to distinguish between Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans. So we spoke out about that. And also with regard to the hate crimes, we covered those heavily, such as the Vincent Chin case in 1982. And we also emphasized that affected all Asian Americans, not just Japanese Americans, because, the assailants didn't really care what ethnicity the victim was, as long as the person was Asian. And Vincent Chin was Chinese American, but he was mistaken for Japanese. So we followed all of those cases and the campaigns to get justice for the victims. I don't know how much that affected the redress movement, but we covered both of those issues extensively.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine it was a very, in some ways, tumultuous time, because here Japanese Americans are fighting for a very specific Japanese American cause, and yet the sort of dominant narrative within mainstream press continues to confuse and maybe mislabel Japanese descent individuals in the United States as being linked to this U.S.-Japan trade war. The other thing I think about is the sort of model minority myth, and it's coming into prominence from the mid 60s onwards, but particularly the role that might have played in continuing to confuse white Americans in particular about this idea of who Japanese Americans are relative to the wealth that they were perceiving in the sort of press coverage of Japan's economic bubble and the sort of export economy. And I'm just wondering again if that sort of came into play as a journalist, surely like covering issues even beyond Japanese American community issues. Were those things that you ever had to deal with directly?
You want to take that?
No, I think that's directed to you. I wasn't there.
Oh, all right. Well, I think another role that the newspapers I was at played was in encouraging more unity among Asian Americans. And even though redress was specifically Japanese American, we addressed other civil rights issues that were of concern to all Asian Americans. Hate crimes, stereotyping in the media, lack of political representation. So we worked towards, I think, Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans being aware that they shared, common issues and needed to work together. And I think we did play a role in that.
Yeah. It also speaks to the changing demographics of the community, too. When you had more multiracial families and more mixed families. So a hate crime to Vincent Chin really could impact anybody, right? I mean, they thought he was Japanese. To the rest of America, we all look Chinese or Japanese or whatever. But it's always important to support other issues. I mean, particularly like today's movement for Black reparations. Who better to speak to the importance of that than the Japanese American community who have gone through that?
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue kind of into this other time period where, post redress, from my perspective, both as someone who's involved in Japanese American movement spaces and also a historian of this time period, our community hasn't been able to fully articulate a shared vision of how to collaborate together and work towards kind of the singular political goal that redress represented. And maybe that is because it is such a universal element of redress, regardless of where people were on the political spectrum, that this is kind of the North Star that people were working towards to get that apology in particular, right? To get the validation and the vindication from the federal government after all those decades, that this was their fault, that the government was at fault for everything that happened to our community. And I think, in a lot of ways, the last 4 decades almost have been a time of experimentation, exploration, trying to figure out what is the role of Japanese Americans in a broader social movement environment. By the mid 90s, I think we kind of see the end of the intensity of the anti-Japanese sentiments that were brought on by the US-Japan trade war after the Nikkei stock market crashes in 1989 and the sort of economic stagnation continues. The economic anxieties and those sort of fears of the white American around replacement or displacement of the United States as a global superpower, those are kind of ameliorated by the economic downturn. And then I think the other part is the influx of Japanese pop culture and cultural export in general, soft power, diplomacy, youth cultures for the last 40 years or more have been intimately intertwined with Japanese pop culture and cultural export. So all of this has sort of helped to create an environment that has been maybe more friendly to Japanese Americans than almost any other generation to date. And I think, part of that too might be 9/11. And I remember, even growing up as a teenager, when 9/11 happened, December 7th every year was still a big issue. And, that's not a day that I would want to be in school because there's going to be a fight that day, most likely. And after September 11th, 2001, all that changed. And I think that was maybe the last piece that really shifted some of the heat onto a newer immigrant community as this idea of the potential face of the enemy, as it was propagandized at that time period. But until we get to COVID, right? And so in the same ways that Vincent Chin is being targeted, despite being Chinese American for something that is allegedly due to the Japanese auto industry, we see Japanese Americans, Southeast Asian Americans, and all different East Asian ethnicities being targets by anti-COVID hate crimes, right? COVID-19 related during the pandemic. And up until that moment, I don't think there has been such a direct attack on the Japanese American community in the context that we would have seen it, like in that trade war time period. So given that, this last 30 or 40 years has been a transition for the generations too. We've lost a number of our Nisei, particularly at this point. I would say the majority of the Nisei, unfortunately, have now left us, and we're losing now some of the elder Sansei even. So there's a changing demographic. There's also a larger number of Shin Nisei, the children of post-war migrants, who are now adults and who are participating within the larger Nikkei community space. So with all of that said, like, how has this shifted the landscape in the last few decades? And what role has the Nikkei press played in this time period? And what is it currently doing in this regard?
Shall I jump in?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, one thing is true that the population shift, the the loss of the Nisei has also resulted in less interest in the community papers, because for the papers to be popular, you have to be concerned about what's happening in the Japanese American community, and if that's not where your interest lies, then you're not going to subscribe. And just in the time that since the time I've been at Pacific Citizen, we've lost the Kashi Mainichi, Tozai Times, New York Nichibei, Utah Nippo, Rocky Chiho, and the Hokubei and the Nichibei, and the Hawaii Herald. So that's very unfortunate, but places more responsibility on the papers that are still around, like us.
Yeah, definitely. It forces us to look at how we can evolve with the times. We had 20 years ago, we started a multiracial column, and now we do a multiracial issue amongst marginalized community. But we feel it's important to give voice to segments like that. I think these days there's a struggle for cultural preservation. So we do an annual Japanese cultural and cultural and Cherry Blossom Festival's guide, whose sole purpose is to preserve Japanese culture in America, whether it's through cultural arts classes, community centers, festivals across the country. Likewise, we do an Open guide to try to do what we can to preserve Japanese culture. But there's still people who are practitioners of those, and I think, we're in preservation mode, I guess, for a lot of things. One thing about 9/11, it's I think Japanese Americans really found our voice during that time, because we stood up for our Muslim South Asian brothers and sisters, and have continued to incorporate their stories within our Day of Remembrance events, which is important. And I think that has been a large part of our role after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, it JK, add some more?
Oh, I was just going to say, we still cover the political issues, like the anti-Asian response to COVID, but a big part of the papers is also the community news, the cultural events, church, sports especially, as well as the obituaries. Unfortunately, people always look at those. So we serve a lot of functions, in different areas of the community, not just political.
Yeah, and thanks to the California State Legislature, they developed the Ethnic Media Outreach Grant. They gave grants to ethnic media to try to address the growing tide of hate. So one thing that we did for the 2 years we received this grant, we developed the PSA of Japantown community leaders, all the organizations. Still amazing that we got all of them to come on camera in a short time in the middle of the pandemic, to educate the community about what hate crimes are, how to report it, what resources are available. And so we also, as a part of that, we actually use the grant funding to place ads in Japanese language publications. And two in particular, we did we got some religious leaders to do a PSA to the Japanese-speaking community, because we figured people from Japan really have a lesser concept of what is a hate crime, because of the majority. It's more a homogenous society. If anything, ethnic Koreans in Japan could complain about hate crimes, right? But so we felt it incumbent upon ourselves to educate the Japanese-speaking population. So we worked and developed these PSAs in Japanese language, put them in national NHK Japan, Crossings TV, which is 8 media markets in America, to let Japanese-speaking people know what is a hate crime and how to report it and what resources are available. And I think it is a responsibility and a role that we were able to take on due to some grant funding.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kenji. And I think it speaks to a couple points. One being that we are a very multi-generational community, and I suppose always have been, but in the sense that as Yonsei and Gosei are playing more important roles in community leadership in the historic legacy Nikkei community orgs, being able to do that work in concert with the newer generations of Japanese immigrants. And also acknowledging that, to a large extent, some of these papers that may be no longer in existence are papers that did sort of fulfill that same purpose that some of the Japanese language publications that you're mentioning are currently doing, in terms of grounding a newer generation of Japanese immigrants in a shared experience, building community, and more importantly, providing resources and opportunities for them to learn about things in a society that is not their native society. So I think, as we kind of come to the end of our time this afternoon, maybe the question that I would pose, JK, is where do we go from here? We're at this kind of moment just in general in media, where print media has really been in decline for the last decade and a half, maybe even earlier than that, but certainly in a very visible way, with major newspapers, even mainstream press, that have gone out of print or are reducing their circulation or the frequency of publication. So, what is your perspective on, like, how do we move this forward? How do we make sure that the Nikkei press is able to continue doing the important work that we do in telling stories that, frankly, other mainstream newspapers don't consider newsworthy because they don't understand our community?
Well, we have been trying to adapt in terms of reaching younger readers. You can now subscribe to either the print or the online version of the paper, or both if you want to. And we have a website which is free, and we are on Facebook and Instagram. So, hopefully that's reaching people that we otherwise wouldn't be able to reach.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Kenji, I don't know if you heard the question, but basically looking at, like, where do we go from here, and what are ways that we can kind of pivot into the digital media landscape? Obviously, Nichi is doing a lot of really exciting programs, including the Films of Remembrance on Demand.
Yeah, I mean, that's in the other presentation that I don't know if we have that queued up, but a lot of things that we've been doing, particularly during the pandemic, is trying to adapt to that, a more isolated community, particularly seniors. During that time, we launched a number of new features, origami lessons with Linda Mihara Paper Tree, monthly Japanese lessons, language lessons, and all. So, yeah, I don't know if we just want to run those slides or.
I think we're running a little short on time.
Okay, let me just go through it real quick then. So also during the pandemic, we published this Japanese American community resource guide that has a lot of cultural and historical features. And then the big thing that we launched, thanks to a grant from the Henry and Tomoya Takahashi Charitable Foundation, in 2022, we launched this thing called the Nichi Bay Cafe, which is a monthly video program that has some of the stories that we publish in the publication, but it's another way to connect, inform, empower the community nationwide, globally through video. And now we're looking at shorts. We're putting it on Instagram to engage a younger audience as well. But truly, and it's innovative, and it's something that I didn't know it was going to last this long, but it's become a large part of what we do. We also launched a Japanese section during the pandemic because a way to engage Shin Issei. But the major thing that we just launched this year, and the videos before, they had outdated numbers because they were old, but we developed Films of Remembrance, in-person program. Not only did it expand to San Jose, Japantown, but this year, as Rob knows, we brought it to Little Tokyo at the Japanese American National Museum and Gardena, perhaps one of the true hearts of the Japanese American community. So we have these in-person film events to educate the public on the Japanese American incarceration. At the same time, this March, we launched something very innovative that I call Netflix on the Budget. Films of Remembrance on Demand. So many of the 120 films we've shown over the last 14 years are now available on a streaming platform where people can watch it from all over around the world. So we're, as I've been saying, remembrance is an act of resistance. And how do we resist this practice of erasure of our community history? So I think that's one way, is the Films of Remembrance on demand. But those are some of the things that we're doing to adapt to the changing environment, and as well as putting more deliberate effort into our social media content. But video has been a huge process of that, and we found out that a lot of our reporters actually have some video background too, so they're creating really interesting and engaging content.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing those recent advances. The last decade has been really exciting to continue to see the Nichi Bay Foundation expand into the digital news market. In terms of Pacific Citizen, one of the big projects on our end has been the digital archives, which has been an incredible resource for historians and journalists to be able to look at such a breadth of the Nikkei experience, almost 100 years now, that are available freely online in PDF formats on Pacific Citizen's website. As we come to a close, I just wanted to ask if either of you had any closing thoughts, JK, and any last messages that you'd like to share with the audience today.
Just that we appreciate the community sticking by us. We could always use the support. Unfortunately, we've had to reduce from 3 days a week to only 1, but I think our subscribers have stuck with us, and we're thankful for that. But we'll try to explore ways to get new readers and continue as long as we can.
Yeah,
absolutely. Any closing thoughts, Kenji?
Yeah, shouts out to our staff. We have a very small staff. The majority of the first 10 years, we only had like full-time staff, but now I think we're double that. But we have a dedicated and very productive crew here who've not only put together these very memorable community events. Like I say, there's some organizations that just do a film festival, some that just do a community festival, some that just do a pilgrimage. But we do all three as a side project to our publication, which is the main thrust of our organization. But we continue to be driven by this sense of trying to innovate with the times, and I'm really thankful that we've had some communities of support for that. We could always use more, of course, because we have to fight the resist the erasure of our community history. And when we started in 2009, I think it became very evident that not only do we have to help empower the community through a hard economic climate, but as people were trying to rush in to look at the old newspapers for research. We're really here to document the history for generations to come. So so that researchers 50 to 100 years from now can get a sense of the community's history, the life, the struggles, triumphs, and the whole breadth of our community experience. And so we're not only here for the present, but we're here for generations.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I think that's a great way to sum up the importance of the Nikkei press, both past, present, and future. We have an opportunity to tell stories that no other publications will. These are important records, not just for our times as a community to be able to understand what's happening in our community world, but for the generations yet to come. So I really appreciate both of you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here. And thank you, everyone who watched at home. We certainly appreciate you joining us for the Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimage 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And thanks to Japanese